Oklahoma. After high school, he spent 4 years in the Air Force, where he trained as a weather observer, which resulted in some worldly traveling, which I bet was fun. Immediately afterwards, he went to college and graduated with a degree in mathematics at the University of Tulsa. He went on to later earn his master's degree in mathematics at the same school. He began working Phillips Petroleum as a computer programmer. 10 years later, he transferred to Phillips Refinery in Old Ocean, Texas, where he continued as a computer programmer. In 2000, he was transferred to the new Chevron Phillips joint venture company, where his work migrated to more data and computer systems management. He retired in 2013 after 33 years with Phillips. During his retirement, he pursued several hobbies, including maintaining and operating a motorcycle, playing tennis, he flew airplanes, and worked with model railroading. While working on model railroading, he began to study the local prototype railroads and found that fascinating history. He now serves as the chief engineer at the Brazos Valley Railroad Society. And we want to thank you for joining us this evening. And if we were in person, we'd give you a round of applause. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over.
Thank you for all that introduction, Jennifer. I'm happy to help present a little bit of history of our area. Prior to 1897, Brazoria was for a short period of time, the capital of the county seat for Texas. Some remnants of that structure still around, but tonight's presentation is on the subject of these silly trains that run around this area. Most people think of them as a railroad. There's actually two major railroads, the Union Pacific and the Brazoria, Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Railroad. The ones in Brazoria is the Union Pacific. The one in Alvin is the Burlington tracks. So history starts with Austin and making an arrangement with the government of Mexico to let people occupy lands along the Brazos River and other areas inland of Texas. So in the 1830s, people started migrating into Texas to permanently live here. Most people would find out that moved all the way to the West Coast to California and Oregon, Washington areas. So anything west of Mississippi was started to be occupied by new residents. And in the 1840s, these people, like all people, were very productive. They were self-sustaining, and also made more agricultural products than they could use. So they would call those cash crops that they would sell to other people. Although there's no way to get them there except by a wagon and a horsepower. The only way you could sell goods to somebody else outside the area, your excess cotton or sugar crops, is to put them on a boat and ship them around the Gulf of Mexico up to the other ports where they could be purchased. Or you could buy goods, the reverse of that. So the two major cash crops in the 1840s became sugar and cotton. And the people, if you're a train, a passenger would be a good item. Recall in the 1840s, Texas became part of the United States as one of the new states, and then introduced the presence of mail, the U.S. mail delivery. So there was another opportunity a need for transportation of goods is the people and mail. And then 1850s, the people in there started emulating what's going on over in Europe and England. They started realizing the value of railroads. So the first one that was built in this area turned out to be a route from downtown Old Harrisburg or Houston, now called Houston, to a town called Columbia on the Brazos River. That way you could move. That railroad would allow you to transfer goods and products from Houston down to the edge of the Brazos River, where they could be loaded onto boats. From there, they could travel down the Brazos River to the Gulf of Mexico, to other ports of calls. At that time, the town was called Columbia, and later became East Columbia, because the town split east and west. After that, in the 1860s, Civil War broke out. Unfortunately, all these railroads ceased to exist, ceased to operate, because of the war needs. The war needed steel, and there wasn't anything left over to use the rails. So there were steel rails that were put in originally, and the train track between Houston and Columbia was removed for the war effort and replaced by wooden rails, which didn't last well, don't work well. But after the Civil War concluded, that route started back up again. Didn't even have an engine to run. They used mule power to operate that train. So that was one of the first railroads. And its goal was to haul people and goods up from Houston down to the East Columbia. Now, during this time of the Civil War, a lot of military leaders developed a good view of how to use the railroads, how to move goods and people. You can move foods and supplies for the military. You can move their firearms and the people themselves quite quickly by railroad. So they're developing a vision for how to use the railroads, of the value of using the railroads. So meanwhile, in the 1870s, an effort was put forth to get this railroad from Houston to Columbia to working again. So they had to get enough financial backing to rebuild it, and it was commonly known as the Houston Tap. And there's a picture of one at the town called Anchor. It's northwest of present-day Angleton. This town doesn't exist. The old 10-wheeler engine and the old Victorian-style depot. This is long before there was electricity or telegraph, and the engines back then were pretty primitive. In the 1870s, there was a group of people decided to bypass using the Harrisburg Railroad and also the politics of the competition between the two towns of Galveston and Houston to access the Central Texas area by building a new railroad from across Texas, all the way from Galveston up to the Central Texas and on over to Santa Fe, New Mexico. In the 1870s, one way the Houston folks could create an advantage over the folks in Galveston was to quarantine Galveston. To say they could state that there was an illness going on with the residents of Galveston, and therefore you should not venture into Galveston or buy products from them. And the folks in Galveston would not be happy about losing their economic opportunities. So let me go to the next page here. The businessmen of Galveston decided to develop a railroad across Texas, and they called this the Gulf Colorado and Santa Fe. They hauled mostly grain and some commonly locally grown pears and oranges and beets. Oranges didn't last long because there was a cold spell in the 1870s. It froze and killed all the orange trees. They kind of declined to nothing. Potatoes were a common product. Cattle was shipped around, or beef products was shipped around. They still hadn't invented reefers yet, so the beef was problematic. And then also passenger and mail traffic. The 1880s, the railroad prospered nicely, and also started develop a business of hauling newspapers. That way people could go, and they built a link so they could publish newspapers in Galveston and distribute them in Houston, of all places. At that time, in the late 1880s, George Seeley also acquired the railroad. Originally, the railroad went into debt for a couple $100,000 in the 1886 time period, I believe. And they sold their business to go into receivership. And George Seeley sponsored that. So if he bought the railroad for $250,000, about $250,000. George Seeley has a very nice museum, a nice house in Galveston, Old Town Galveston. It's a beautiful brick building, still exists. It's worth going to see sometime. So meanwhile, the other entrepreneurs decided to make some money by bypassing the Brazos River to go from the port of Columbia, and goes all the way down to Freeport. So they developed a railroad they called the Velasco Railroad. They went to a town that was on the beach of the Gulf of Mexico that was called Velasco. It later moved inland. Hurricanes were problematic. There's a picture of one of the first little freight buildings that was down there. I think that picture is misdated. It's probably 1893. I'm always puzzled by that photograph, but it's real. Looks good. But it was also, that way they could ship goods from Houston down to Anchor, a little junction called Anchor, then take this Brazos Valley Railroad, that's what it was called, down to Velasco and Freeport, and bypass using a short boat ride up the Brazos River, and bypass the hazards of the Brazos River. And that was becoming a very good business as far as railroads nationally, because the railroads had developed the Transcontinental Railroad, which really opened up the interior of the United States by letting more people. Around 1900, some other people, this would be a guy named Uriah Lott and B.F. Yoakum, came upon the idea of developing a railroad from Mexico all the way up to Chicago. So they already had that. If they could get to New Orleans, there was already existing railroads that you could take from New Orleans north to Chicago, but from New Orleans south and west along the coast of Mexico, Gulf of Mexico, there was no railroad to get you to Mexico City. So the gentleman decided to build a route from the Mexican border at Brownsville all the way up to New Orleans. And a picture of Mr. Yoakum for you to look at. So Mr. Yoakum was the primary person who planned the construction of the route from Brownsville to New Orleans. And they named that railroad the St. Louis Brownsville line in Mexico. And I think I'll bring you a picture of the route. There's a picture of one of their engines, of the route of the railroad. It's in here somewhere. Oh, the route actually changed. It went from Brownsville all the way up to Bay City. And at that point, it was scheduled to go from Bay City up to directly to Columbia, and then take advantage of the existing Brazos Valley Columbia Tap Railroad to all the way to Houston. But the people who lived in Angleton and the towns in Galveston were going to miss out on the opportunity to have a railroad along that route. So they'll lose out on the business opportunities. So they waived. It was a common thing. The townsmen in Angleton and Galveston put up some funds to attract the development of the railroad to go east on into Brazoria through Angleton, and then at a junction called Algoa, which is a newly created place just southeast of Alvin, down towards Hitchcock. Oh, I'll pitch a picture of it's coming up. So you can see the Brownsville down along is at the Mexican border. The railroads followed inland the border through Angleton, and Algoa Junction is where it intersects the Santa Fe and goes up to Houston. And to this day, that route is still actively used. So what was on that railroad was a lot of petroleum products were starting to show up. Still had cotton and sulfur. The labor-intensive cotton and sugar markets were used, dependent on labor from the prison inmates. The Civil War put an end to the forced slave labor and the free slave labor. And so the sugar and cotton markets declined quite a bit, but they still were there. There's still sugar cane. In the around 1900s, sulfur was discovered. Well, in the 1890s, there was a lot of effort looking for crude oil. It was a useful commodity. Some crude oil was discovered in the Brazoria County area, and that became some of the petroleum products that were needed to be shipping by rail. At that time, there weren't very many underground pipelines. They didn't come along till later. And in the process of exploring for crude oil, the developers ran into sulfur, and sulfur became another commercial product. But the problem with sulfur is how do you get it out of the ground? It's typically around 1,500 feet down below. Well, it turns out sulfur has a low melting point. You heat it up to a couple hundred degrees, and it'll turn into a liquid, and it can be just pumped up to the surface. And sulfur and shipping sulfur down to the port of Galveston became a good venture. Today, with the process of heating sulfur requires hot water, in which turn means you have to have some kind of fuel to heat up water. And so the trains were used to haul in the fuel oils to burn, to heat up the furnaces, to make hot water, steam, to go down and pump out the sulfur. Today, you see all kinds of additional products on the trains, such as mostly chemicals coming out of the Dow plants and the other plants in the Lake Jackson area. There are the Phillips plant in Old Ocean has a lot of small kinds. I'm looking for the name, but they call them the chemical products, or such as hexanes and stuff they used to make the plastic products out of. You also see trains traveling through the area. They're not traffic. They're not developed locally, but they come from other areas. They're just sort of passing through. Those, you see a lot of automobile cars. You see container trains, plus the usual hoppers and chemicals. You also see grain trains in the Brazoria area coming out of Houston, going south, I guess, all the way to Mexico. Part of the confusion when we talk to other people, the names of the railroad owners sometimes would use a local common name as the name of the railroad. So the train from Houston south to Columbia was developed by the International Great Northern and later taken over by Missouri Pacific. The International Great Northern's, the route from Houston down to Columbia, had the nickname as the Columbia Tap, so it was commonly called the Columbia Tap. The railroad between Anchor and the port of Freeport or Velasco was called the Velasco Route. That's the name of the company. Was the Houston and Brazos Valley Railroad. I've got a typo. It says HGBVR. The other route that followed the coastline was called the St. Louis, Brownsville, Mexico, which never used their name on anything except a couple of engines and a couple of boxcars. But they were commonly called the Gulf Coastline. So if you want to look for information about that railroad, most likely you'll find it under the Gulf Coastline's name. And as time went on, the Santa Fe, the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe Railroad, owned by the Sealy family, was taken over or merged with the Santa Fe Railroad. I think I got a slide on that. Yes. The International Great Northern, St. Louis, Brownsville. Houston, Brazos Valley, St. Louis, Brownsville, and then New Orleans and Texas, Mexico railroads were all merged together or bought by the Missouri Pacific Railroad. And in the 1950s, they completed the transition And the names of these other railroads just disappeared after 1956. And then later in the 1980s, the two main railroads, Union Pacific and Missouri Pacific Railroad, merged together to form one railroad. I want to show you a example of the railroad development. In this, going diagonally from lower left to upper right, is this 2 slides? Okay, I missed one. Backward, that's that order. The upper right is this northeast. This north is the top of the map. Is the little passing siding in Angleton where you can store some cars. There's a track that goes north and south. That's the original Houston Brazos Valley railroad tracks. And there's a Y in the middle. That yard has grown. It went from 2 tracks up until the 1980s, after which it became 7 tracks, is what this picture shows. And next one is now it's expanded up to 30 more tracks. I believe there's 32 additional tracks were added. So it's grown quite a bit. I wish Google Earth would have a newer picture because the rest of the yard is completed now. There's a photograph of the plant out in Old Ocean, Texas, the Phillips plant up until the 1980s. As a single track goes across the bottom, near the bottom. This is where I wish my cursor worked. There's a track that goes from left to right, and the straight bottom dead center, there's a little curl piece that goes straight north. That's the train track that carried natural gas products into the plant or from the plant in Old Ocean. And today that plant has grown a bit. It's expanded to the north and west. In fact, they even moved Highway 35 to go around the expansion of the plant. That expansion is plastic pellets. The plant now makes polyethylene pellet in a plastic pellet form. So it ships out about 20 cars a day of plastic pellets and brings in about 10 or so or fewer tank cars loaded with hexane products that are needed to make the plastic pellets. Most of the plastic pellets developed by the Chevron company are produced in Baytown. But Baytown's landlocked. They can't grow their plant any bigger. So they decided to expand, but not expand in Baytown, but do the expansion work in Old Ocean. So a summary, today we have trains with all kinds of chemical products, ethanols and ethanes and methanes, and all kinds of chemical products. The plastic pellets is a common product. Coke comes out of the Phillips plant. They produce Coke is like a high energy coal, similar in appearance. And in the Clute area, there's some trains of scrap metals that are created. Not very many, but you see a few scrap metal cars coming out of Clute. Coming out of the port of Freeport, you'll see, leaving the port, you'll see automobiles being offloaded into Freeport onto ocean-going boats. And coming in through Freeport, you'll see steel and other fruits, mainly the Dole pineapples, Dole bananas is a common fruit coming in from Freeport. And you see other trains that just pass through. You'll see that they're not coming, they're just passing through. Those are the grain trains and various container trains. Container trains are usually about 60 cars long, and the grain trains are usually 100 cars long. They're quite heavy. And you see some other maintenance trains carrying sand and other repair materials. Usually, and occasionally you see an oddity. That's the end of my subjects. Was there any questions, Jennifer?
Get this one real quick. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Again, if anybody has questions, just type them down. Click on that bottom right. You'll see the chat button. Click on it, type your question in, or just say me and I can unmute you so that you can ask your question. And while they're asking or thinking of their questions, I had a couple I was going to ask you.
Yes.
So the early train that was built between Houston and Columbia, I guess that was in the 1850s, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
53.
Do you know who actually built that railway? the
They-
railroad itself, was that slave labor that did that, or was it other labor that built it? Do you know?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
I, I've got reports on that. I just didn't remember to reread that before I did tonight's presentation.
Oh, that's
I
okay.
read
I was
some
just
others.
curious.
It parallels Highway 521. If you travel up and down 521, you look about 50 to 100 feet to the west of 521, you'll see the roadbed for that railroad.
So you can still
But
kind of see reminiscence of where it was?
oh yes,
Okay.
where it crosses Oyster Creek on 521, you can see the earthworks that were used to support the rails as it. But the a resident of West Columbia named Charlie Ogilvie took a picture of that bridge being torn down. They've been using inmate labor to take it down.
Okay. Okay.
But I don't really recall the names of the investors or the general contractor who built the railroad. But it was
Okay.
pretty primitive. I'm not even sure they had. I'm not sure they had the I-beam style rail back in the 1850s. I think it may have been just a flat metal ribbon bar they rode on.
Wow.
So the railroads technology has changed a lot from then. They didn't have brakes on the cars. They had hand brakes or manually operated brakes. They didn't have a good process for making quality railroad ties. They hadn't invented creosoting process of preserving the ties so they wouldn't rot so fast. They hadn't developed the plates, the tie plates that go on top between the bottom of the rail and the wood tie. That hadn't been invented yet. So they were a high maintenance, short life expectancy type of
So
construction.
they would use a hand brake to stop the trains. How fast were these trains going?
At most 15 miles an hour. They were
Oh,
pretty they were pretty small engines back then. They hadn't developed a much larger. They didn't come around until 1910, around 1900s, when the bigger engines started showing up, faster and more powerful.
but it was still faster than the boat?
Yes, yes. So the trains didn't have to deal with the current, river current. They go up and down. They have to deal with dead trees in the water, maybe a dead tree on top of the railroad. South of that, what I just referenced to, Oyster Creek and 521, there's a grassy area with just some trees. That's where a town by the name of Hines was located. It was one of the first post offices in Brazoria, in Texas, and Brazoria County.
Actually, somebody had a comment, Mary Helen. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you real quick.
Okay.
Are you there, Mary Helen?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. You had a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say I've lived in this area since 1943, and I never realized that there was such a large rail system here. I mean, I've seen them, but I didn't realize that it was so large. And knowing about all the trains that were here and being used to transport the things all over the country is really exciting to me. I mean, I've been here since I was 5 years old, and it's just really exciting to know that all of these things were going on. And of course, back then I wouldn't have known it, but now, and I've loved the history of the area. So it's always so much fun to me to hear these things that I was not aware of when I was so much younger. So I really appreciate this program that you've given, and I've really enjoyed it.
I hope you appreciated that there was a lot of competition between the towns of Galveston and Houston. And they were looking for ways to outdo each other on business ventures. So there was a intentional lack of railroads between the two towns that was created. But the first one, the International Great Northern Track, goes pretty much from Main Street downtown south to Columbia, bypassed all that business competition, just went straight. But it didn't last long. The Civil War kind of put it into that railroad. But it was the right of way was maintained. It still exists to this day. All the way up
So you said that Houston would do like quarantine Galveston. Can you expand on that a little bit?
It's kind of like saying Galveston has coronavirus. Nobody go there. avoid going to Galveston because everybody down there's got coronavirus or they would have the smallpox or something. They would publish those in the local papers and say avoid that town.
Oh.
That probably was based on real medical problems, but I couldn't figure out what they meant by quarantines, but it was actually the medical type quarantines. So they would take advantage.
Interesting to see.
If somebody got a flu, they would really publicize that there was a big rampant flu virus running around in the other town.
So they just kind of exaggerated to keep business away from Galveston.
So one thing I haven't studied is the development of the intercoastal waterway, not what's the river basin? It goes up the Trinity River had not been developed or deepened as much to allow the bigger boats to get in. Most of the boats stopped off at Galveston.
That's interesting.
Have you seen the Sealy house in Galveston? It's beautiful.
I have not seen the Sealy house. I've seen the Moody one, and but I haven't seen the Sealy.
Okay.
I have seen the Alvin Depot, though, up in Alvin.
Yeah.
They have a big, and the railroad still, I know, is very active through Alvin.
It sure is. It's quite active. It's one of the two railroads that go down to Galveston from the Houston area. And north of us is the Parish Power Plant. They use coal for fuel to burn to create electricity. Create the steam to be able to create electricity. So you see coal trains coming out of Wyoming all the way to the Parish Power Plant.
I had one other question. That Columbia Tap, how often was it used? Was it a regular? Was it a very active?
They had 2 trains a day, a morning and an afternoon. It took about 2.5 hours on a good day when the engines were running, back when they first started using steam engines. So that was a mix of freight and passenger. They used to have, in the photographs, you'll see a couple of passenger cars and a couple of freight cars. That one photograph showed it was an occasion where the 2 trains passed each other at anchor. So like a morning and an afternoon. Mike Bailey has a copy of the timetable for that railroad. It's really old. I don't have an original. I just have a photograph copy of that timetable. But just 2 trains a day. That's pretty active though for Civil War era.
So it was active for what, maybe a decade?
Yes. Well, before the war, it was only active from 53 to the 60s. That's less than 10 years.
Okay.
And then the Civil War's demand took the steel rails up.
How efficient were the wooden rails? That would seem odd.
The cars were much lighter in weight than you visualize. They were much smaller, so they would not crush the wooden rails. If you just take something like the equivalent of a 2x4 stand up on edge, it'll duplicate the appearance of a rail. And you could just, and they use mules to haul the passenger cars. So it was not a real big operations, and it was very slow.
Well, I know on the boats before the rails came, like you mentioned in the 1840s, the boats would say goods first and then the passengers were secondary. They really wanted to fill their boats up with goods first because that's where they made more of their money. Was it kind of the same way with the railroads once they started being more active in the 1850s, 1860s?
Yes, the passengers were less revenue generating then. They were easier as a cargo. They're easier handling because most cargo doesn't have feet to walk on.
Right.
So there's like self-loading cargo, but they never put high enough fares on the prices on the tickets to make it very profitable. Very few are profitable. It's still that way to this day.
Do you know how much those tickets were?
No, I don't. That's an odd thing. I can see that it's easy to find the timetables that show when they do, but to find a table that shows how much the ticket costs, I've never have encountered that information.
That'd be interesting to try and
So you
find.
think about, you go to your passenger depot in Angleton, and you want to buy a ticket to St. Louis, Missouri. So you're going to be traveling over rails on different railroad companies' rails. And somehow the agent there in Angleton would have that information, how much to charge for each section of the track and total up the total ticket fare. I don't know how that works. I just haven't seen that information. It's not printed on timetables. It could be just, it could be coincidental information, but I just don't know where the process. There is some, let me go get one out of the library. I'll put it in front of the camera. There's a book called Official Guide. Our library is not as big as yours, so I can walk in and grab a book and come back out a lot faster. There's a picture holding in front of the camera. It's an official guide to railroads. It's a pretty thick book. This is what that agent in Angleton would have to tell you how to buy a ticket from Angleton to St. Louis. So you'd have list of the names of the railroads, and it would have in that book, well, you'll see pictures of the routes that railroad took. So that way you just follow the lines until you find the way to get there. It could be possible that the Missouri Pacific had a way to do that without having to go to a secondary railroad. But you look at his books; they have the times and so the ticket agent would have to figure out when you arrive. So how much time you'd have to between when you arrived at one town and when you departed to go on to continue on with your route. But darn it, these books don't have prices in them.
What is the name of the book?
Official Guide to Railways. I don't know if you can see it. They're made out of a newsprint, so they fox pretty bad. They turn brown. They don't last well.
So it's a old book.
Yeah, they're published annually. The one I had in my hand was published in 1964.
Okay.
We didn't have the internet at that time, so it was all paper system.
I wonder if we have any in our collection. I'll have to ask Michael. That would be interesting.
Yes. But that's a way to figure out that type of publication would be a way to figure out when the trains run and and what the routes they take and how you would get from one town to the next to finally get your destination. It might take the ticket agent a while to figure all that out if he's not familiar with the routes. But that's their job. That's the ticket agent's job to know how to do that. So I guess there's something like a monthly publication that would have a way to figure out the prices of the tickets or some kind of guide. And they must have been very frequently updated, so they probably didn't last very long. I'm guessing they would get more than one a year. The prices are not actually printed in these books. So they were probably a secondary piece of paper that came out through company correspondence. And they were thrown away once that time period passed on. Now you fly airplanes, you get aeronautical charts that are only dated, they're only good for a few months. And you get a subscription of those magazines to the charts, and they're only good for a few months. Probably the same thing with boat traffic. And once it expired, you just throw it away. So that's kind of why these books come and go, because they're probably just thrown away. If you weren't careful, you'd wind up with a whole bunch of them piled up in your closet, and somebody complained about the storage space. Better spend on something else.
Okay.
So there was a few railroads.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The main north-south would be the Santa Fe Railroads, which is today called Burlington Northern. Burlington Northern merged with the Santa Fe Railroad. They go from Houston down to, or south of Houston. There's a route that goes parallel from Mykyle Road. It goes straight south to Pearland, to Alvin, through Pearland, and it goes to Alvin. From there, it merges with the other track, goes to Galveston. The other main railroad is the Missouri Pacific or Union Pacific Railroad. It goes from the Gulf Coast through Angleton. And then there's the little short line that went from Houston down to Columbia or East Columbia. That was the international, owned by the International Great Northern. That railroad changed ownership about 4 times before the International Great Northern took over it. So it had quite a few names, but they're all various permutations of the Columbia Tap or International Great Northern. And
the railroads that are down here now, they're just freight, right? I know that there's Amtrak in Houston that's for passengers,
yes.
But all
Yes.
Brazoria County are just freight, basically for the chemical
Yes.
plants and petrochemicals, and right?
Yeah. Yes. The trains fill in the gaps where there's no pipelines underground to move the materials. Most of the trains haul materials that you can't put in a pipeline. You can't put a piece of wood in a pipeline and pump it out the other end.
Right.
It's usually they put fuel oils and propane gases in pipelines, and the rest of it's all by rail cars. You'll see occasionally a lumber car full of lumber, and you see windmill turbine blades.
I've seen plenty of those. Yes, I've seen a lot of trucks with those.
Yes.
I'm not around the railroads as much as I was when I lived out in Richwood, or when I used to go to Alvin. I used to go to Alvin quite a bit, so I know the railroad the trains would go through Alvin quite a bit.
Yes.
So I haven't seen them with those windmill turbines, I guess, or whatever they are. Yeah, I haven't
Yes.
seen those.
Wind generators.
There
They're
you go.
pretty big. There are some around here. Most of the windmill blades are about 100 feet long, but there are some that are close to 200 feet long. I've never seen any of those around here. There's some
Wow.
really big wind generators, but they're not here. You see some out in California. They're pretty big,
Okay.
but around here they're much smaller. The ones that you commonly see either on a road or on a rail car. Some parts of them are too big to put on a rail car. The generator sections, you don't see propeller hubs on rail cars, and you don't see the larger tower sections that are at the bottom of the towers. They're pretty big. They're beyond the width limitations of rail cars.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentation this evening.
Okay.
Like Mary Helen said, I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I don't see any other questions. So with that, I think we're going to call it an evening. But
Okay.
thank you again. Really appreciated it. If anybody wants to refer to this program later on, we are going to put it on the museum's YouTube channel. So check it out. We should have a link to that channel on our website. Again, thank you, Mr. Williams. We really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right. You have a great evening.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye.